Tonight, you do not need to try to be calm. You do not need to force yourself to sleep, and you do not have to push your thoughts away. Just sit for a moment, breathe a little slower, and let the darkness gently fall over your shoulders like an old blanket. Here, no one expects you to be strong. No one needs you to be cheerful or perfect. Everything you carried with you today, the tiredness, the worries, the sadness, or the emptiness, can be set down right beside you, like a gentle friend who knows it is time to rest. Maybe you have lived through a day longer than you planned, spoken more than you wanted, or stayed so quiet that you could hear the sound of your own heartbeat. Maybe you have held too much inside and never let any of it go. But here, in this space, you do not need to hold on anymore. Let your breath do what it knows how to do. Flow in, flow out soft as water finding its old path again. Let the gentle sounds around you, the wind, the night, or the slowing beat of your heart become the background music of your soul. From now until the first light of dawn touches your window, we will walk through 10 meditation stories. Each story is a breath, a pause, a resting place between two thoughts. They are not here to teach you anything. They do not ask you to understand. They are simply invitations to feel with silence, with your heart, and with eyes that are slowly beginning to close. So let your shoulders drop. Let your hands fall away from everything you were planning, and let your breath guide you home. Tonight, there is nothing else you need to do. No effort, no resistance. Just let go and let sleep come like an old friend, slow, kind, and so good at waiting. If you feel your heart starting to soften, if you hear something in each breath that sounds a little like peace, then stay. Subscribe to the channel so each night you can return to this place where the meditation stories are still waiting, just to remind you that peace has never left. It is still inside you, just waiting to be touched. Now that your breath has slowed, your shoulders have softened, and the sounds of the day have faded like mist beyond the window, you may feel a quiet space gently opening inside. That quiet space is where every story begins, not loud, not rushed, just like a breeze through the garden, carrying the scent of tea and the last light of the day. Let your mind stay here in this moment. You do not need to remember anything. You do not need to figure anything out. The stories to come are not meant for understanding. They are meant for listening, so that each image, each rhythm of words can slowly sink into you like drops of water falling into an old ceramic bowl. And now, as the night has stilled and the porch light still glows, This is where the first story begins. The first story: the light on the porch. The old house stood at the edge of the small town where the last row of lamps met the quiet fields. Each evening, when the air began to cool and the sky faded from rose to indigo, an old man would step outside and light a single lantern by his wooden door. He never missed a night. The flame was small, but steady, enclosed in a glass case with a brass handle worn smooth by his fingers. From the road below, travelers sometimes wondered why the light was always there, even when there was no one left to visit. Years ago, the lantern had been a signal, a simple way for his wife to find the house after the evening market, for neighbors to stop by for tea, for lost wanderers to know that someone was still awake. But she had passed on, and the neighbors had moved away, and the road was rarely used now, except by the wind. Still, the old man kept lighting the lantern. He said it helped him remember that light did not exist for a reason. It existed because it could. At night, he would sit by the window and watch the flickering glow brush the wooden frame. Moths circled the glass, drawing tiny trembling orbits before disappearing back into the dark. Sometimes the old man would whisper to them, "Don't burn yourselves too quickly. There's more night to see." He had learned that light was gentlest when no one demanded it to be bright. One winter, the snow came early. It covered the roof, the steps, and finally, the small patch of garden where mint and lavender had once grown. The old man's joints ached. His breath came short, but still he carried the lantern out each night. The glass fogged beneath his hand, and the flame quivered with every gust of wind. One night, the storm grew harsh wind against the shutter's ice in the hinges' branches, cracking under their own white weight. When the lantern's light faltered, he shielded it with his palm and whispered, "Easy now. Stay a while longer." He could have gone inside. He could have left the world to its darkness. But something in him knew that even the smallest flame can teach the night about gentleness. So he stood there until the storm softened into quiet flakes, until the air turned clear again, and the lantern's glass shone with tiny stars. Days passed into months. Sometimes the wick burned low, and he replaced it with a piece of cotton torn from an old scarf. The oil ran out, and he learned to use a bit of melted wax instead. Light found its way, as it always does. On some evenings, when fog rolled down from the hills, the lantern became a faint blur, more glow than fire, more memory than flame. Those were the nights he liked best, when the world seemed to be dreaming alongside him. Then, one spring, a traveler came along the empty road. She was tired, her boots covered in dust, her hair damp with mist. From a distance, she saw a small, trembling light beside the wooden door and thought she was imagining it. But as she came closer, the glow steadied, and she heard the creak of an old chair inside. She knocked softly. The door opened. The old man looked at her eyes, pale like washed stone, and smiled as if she were someone returning home. She apologized for disturbing him. He shook his head and said, "No disturbance." The lantern was waiting. She sat with him for tea. The room smelled faintly of herbs and warm dust. They talked about the weather, the silence, and how nights could be long when one had too many thoughts. She told him she'd lost her way, traveling north, that her map had blurred in the rain. He nodded and said, "Maps don't know about kindness, but lanterns do." When she left, the wind had calmed. She looked back once, and the light still burned golden in the dusk. In that moment, she realized she didn't feel lost anymore. Even miles away, when the light was gone from view, she still felt it, a quiet warmth in her chest that did not fade. Years later, after the old man had passed, the house remained. The neighbors' children grew and left. The field became wild again. But each evening, when the air turned cool and the crickets began their slow song, a faint light would appear beside the door. No one could explain it. Some said it was the way the moon reflected on the glass. Others thought it was memory itself, learning how to glow. Travelers who passed by said the same thing, that when they saw that light, something inside them softened. They walked a little slower, breathed a little deeper, and felt, for reasons they couldn't name, a little less alone. The lantern did not speak. It never moved. It simply shone, steady and unassuming, as if whispering to whoever looked its way, "You have made it through another night. You are still here. That is enough." And perhaps that is what the lantern had been saying all along. That peace is not the absence of darkness, but the willingness to stay kind within it. So tonight, as you rest, imagine that small light glowing quietly beside a door somewhere far away. Let it remind you that you do not need to be bright to be worthy, nor loud to be seen. Even the faintest flame held with care is enough to warm an entire world. Breathe in slowly. Let the air settle. Deep inside you. You are the lantern. You are the light beside the door. And the night, gentle and endless, is simply learning to rest around you. Story 2. The Mirror of Quiet Rain. It began with rain, not the kind that rushed or shouted, but the kind that arrived softly, like someone remembering a song half forgotten. The first drops landed on the roof of an old studio by the river, tapping against the tin in a rhythm that seemed unsure of itself. Inside, a painter sat before a blank canvas. His brushes were clean-lined neatly in a jar, and a cup of tea steamed faintly by his side. For hours, he had tried to begin, but the image would not come. He had wanted to paint the sound of rain. Not the rain itself, not the gray sky, or the puddles, or the dripping branches, but the space between each drop, the hush that lingers when the world pauses to listen. He had traveled to this small town by the river because he thought quietness would help him see better. Yet the longer he stayed, the more he realized that silence could be louder than any noise. He dipped his brush into water, lifted it, and let a bead fall onto the canvas. It rolled down slowly, leaving a translucent trail. The line shimmered like a breath before vanishing. Outside, the river stirred. He watched it through the open window, the way the surface shivered with rain, the way ripples crossed and blended until no one could tell which circle had begun first. He wondered if art was meant to capture moments like these, or simply to stand still enough for them to pass through. The rain deepened, filling the garden with a smell of wet soil and jasmine. The painter closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw not the storm, but memory, the day his teacher once told him, "Do not chase beauty. Sit where it will find you." He had not understood then. He had believed in effort, in precision, in the discipline of perfect lines. But perfection had kept him restless, like someone trying to hold a cloud in their hands. Hours slipped by. The tea went cold. The sky dimmed into a soft violet. On the far bank, a woman in a blue coat was walking, holding her umbrella slightly crooked, as if she did not mind getting wet. She paused by the water's edge, leaned down, and touched the surface with her fingertips. The painter watched her reflection scatter and return, scatter and return. Something in that movement, that acceptance of impermanence, loosened the knot in his chest. He set the brush aside and stepped outside barefoot. The ground was cool, almost tender. The rain was fine now, a mist more than a fall. He walked to the edge of the veranda and let his palms fill with water. The river's reflection quivered, showing a blur of sky trees, and himself, an image without borders. He realized that the rain was not something to paint. It was something to listen to, until he could no longer tell where his own thoughts ended and the world began. That night, he left the canvas untouched. Instead, he placed it under the eaves, where drops could mark it freely. By morning, faint stains had bloomed pale gray petals of water, irregular and unplanned. He smiled for the first time in weeks. "So this is what it wants to be," he whispered. The painting had painted itself. As days passed, the river swelled and retreated. The painter began a new ritual. Each dawn, he would sit by the window with his cup of tea and watch the surface of the water. He noticed how light moved differently each day, sometimes silver, sometimes gold, sometimes the dull white of a forgotten letter. The river had no need to remember its reflections. It simply received whatever appeared. He started to believe that the truest art was not creation, but reflection. One morning, a boy from the village came running to see him. "Teacher," the boy said, breathless, "the mayor wants to buy your paintings for the town hall." The painter looked at the stacks of canvases leaning against the wall. Storms, mountains, fields, and felt a quiet fatigue. "Tell him," he said gently, "that they belong to the rain." The boy frowned, not understanding, but nodded and left. The painter poured the boy a cup of tea before he went. It was his way of saying thank you for carrying a message that could not yet be understood. Years drifted by like slow currents. The painter grew older. His hands trembled slightly, and his sight dimmed. But the rain still came, and each time it did, he opened the window. Once, a traveler stopped at his studio, soaked from a sudden shower. She saw the walls covered not with landscapes, but with pieces of fabric paper and wood, all stained by water. She asked, "Why so many?" He smiled and said, "Because the rain never repeats itself, and I do not want to miss its handwriting." She stayed that evening, listening with him to the drizzle. After a while, she asked, "Do you ever paint when it doesn't rain?" He thought for a long time before replying, "When it doesn't rain, I watch the river remember." She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. Sometimes, understanding is just sitting beside someone until words dissolve into the same rhythm. When he passed away, the townspeople found hundreds of small canvases in his studio, each marked with gentle traces of water, some barely visible, some shaped like wings or leaves or footprints. They hung them in the local hall, where visitors often said they could hear a faint sound of rain when they stood still enough. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps it was the painter still whispering through the stains. Quietness has a voice too. Many years later, a child visited the hall with her grandmother. She stared at one of the pieces, a pale sheet with almost nothing on it, and asked, "Why did he not finish this one?" The grandmother smiled. "He did," she said. "The rain just stopped talking." Outside, it began to drizzle again, fine as silk. The child pressed her hand against the window and watched her reflection merge with the gray sky. For a brief moment, she felt what the painter must have felt, that the line between herself and the world had blurred, and that maybe, just maybe, there was peace in that. And if you are listening now, somewhere in the quiet between your own thoughts, you might hear it too. The hush that follows a single drop, the soft mirror that holds every reflection and asks for nothing in return. Let it wash over you. Let it remind you that stillness is not emptiness, and that even the faintest sound of rain can teach the heart how to listen. Rest now. The world is painting itself around you, and you, without effort, without trying, are already part of its art. Story 3. The Pebble Under the Pillow. There was once a small monastery near the foot of the mountains, where the river curved like a line of ink brushed by a calm hand. The temple was quiet, always wrapped in the scent of pine resin and smoke from the morning lamps. The monks rose before dawn, when the world was still half dreaming, and walked barefoot through the stone corridors to the meditation hall. Among them was a young novice named Aki, whose eyes still carried the restless shine of someone trying too hard to be calm. Aki had come to the monastery a year ago after his mother died. He had been searching for something he could not name. Maybe peace, maybe forgiveness, maybe an answer to the aching question that haunted him each night. He worked hard, perhaps too hard. He swept the courtyard twice, memorized every chant, copied the sutras until his wrist ached, and sat longer than anyone else in meditation. But no matter how long he sat, his thoughts ran like wild horses, circling the same places again and again. One night, unable to sleep, he approached the old abbot, who sat beneath the lanterns in the hall, mending a torn robe. Master Aki said softly, "I try every day to quiet my mind, but it never stays still. Even in my dreams, thoughts chase each other like leaves in the wind. What should I do?" The abbot looked up. His needle paused above the cloth. His face was thin, his eyes gentle like the slow river in winter. "Take this," he said, reaching into a small wooden box beside him. He placed a smooth gray pebble in Aki's palm. "Keep it under your pillow every night. When you wake, touch it and remember what it feels like." Aki looked at the pebble. Plain, unmarked, ordinary. "Will it help me find peace?" he asked. The abbot smiled. "That depends on how heavy you make it." That night, Aki slid the pebble beneath his pillow. It pressed faintly against his cheek as he lay down cool and small. He thought of the abbot's words, "How heavy you make it." The idea puzzled him. The pebble was light. It could not weigh much. But as he closed his eyes, thoughts began to gather around it. His mother's voice, the sound of the river, the shape of the moon, seen through the pine trees. By morning, the pebble felt heavier. For the next few weeks, he followed the same ritual. Each night, before sleeping, he placed the pebble beneath his pillow and whispered a prayer. "May my mind grow still." But stillness never came. The pebble grew colder, heavier somehow, and he began to dream of carrying stones up a hill that never ended. One morning, after a long, restless night, he lifted the pillow and found the pebble resting there as always. Yet he could have sworn it had grown larger. He went to the abbot. "Master," he said, "the pebble grows heavier each night. I think it's because my heart will not rest." The old man laughed softly. "Then perhaps your heart is what lies beneath your pillow, not the stone." Aki did not understand, but he bowed and left. That evening, he sat by the river, holding the pebble in his palm. The water moved gently, reflecting the slow clouds. He dipped the stone into the current, watching bubbles form and drift away. The pebble looked lighter in the water, almost floating. He wondered if that was the lesson, that peace was not about removing weight, but learning how to let it drift. Still, the nights were long. Sometimes he woke before dawn, feeling the pebble under his head, like a secret reminder of all he hadn't let go. One particularly restless night, he dreamed that his mother sat beside his bed, brushing his hair with her fingers. She looked the same as she had before her illness. Her smile soft, her eyes warm. She lifted the pillow, took the pebble, and placed it in his open hand. "You've mistaken remembering for holding," she said. "You can love without clutching." When Aki woke, tears had dried on his face. The pebble was still there, but for the first time it felt warm. He carried it to the abbot and told him the dream. The abbot nodded. When water meets stone, it teaches it to yield. When sorrow meets time, it teaches us to love differently. From that day, Aki began to treat the pebble not as a burden, but as a teacher. He took it with him to the meditation hall, holding it in his palm while he breathed. When thoughts arose, he did not chase them away. He simply let them settle like sand sinking to the bottom of a clear pond. He realized that thoughts were not enemies, only waves in a much larger sea. And sometimes, When the mind grows quiet, the waves begin to mirror the sky. Months passed. The seasons changed. The scent of the forest turned from pine to rain to frost. Aki grew calmer, his eyes softer, his steps slower. But one morning, when he woke, the pebble was gone. He lifted the pillow, checked the floor, even the folds of his blanket. Nothing. Panic rose in him like a tide. He ran to the abbot, breathless. "Master, the pebble is gone." The abbot poured him tea, unhurried. Then, perhaps, he said, "You no longer need it." "But I didn't mean to lose it." Aki said, his voice trembling. "It's all I had to remind me of what you taught." The abbot smiled. "The lesson does not live in the stone, my child. It lives in the space where the stone once was." For a moment, Aki did not understand. Then he felt it, a strange lightness in his chest, a stillness not forced, but found. The weight beneath his pillow had become the quiet beneath his breath. He realized that the stone was never about peace itself. It was about learning how to notice the moment peace had already arrived. That night, when he lay down to sleep, he slipped his hand beneath the pillow, though nothing waited there. He smiled. The absence itself felt full, as though the whole mountain had been placed under his head, cool and vast and kind. He slept deeply, dreamlessly, like the river resting between stones. Years later, after the abbot had passed, and Aki had become the new caretaker of the monastery, a young boy arrived seeking peace. He was thin, anxious, his eyes always darting toward the horizon. He told Aki he couldn't stop his thoughts, that he felt restless, even in prayer. Aki listened quietly, then reached into his sleeve and drew out a small gray pebble. Not the same one, but close enough. He placed it in the boy's hand. "Keep this under your pillow," Aki said, smiling. "When you wake, touch it and remember what it feels like." The boy frowned. "Will it help me find peace?" Aki looked toward the window, where rain had begun to fall over the forest, each drop catching the faint glow of the lanterns. "That depends," he said softly, "on how heavy you make it." And so the circle began again, quiet and endless, like the rhythm of breath that carries all lives forward, a giving, a keeping, a letting go. Tonight, if you find yourself lying awake, turning over the same thoughts, the same worries, imagine a small stone resting beneath your pillow. It is not there to silence you, nor to weigh you down. It is only there to remind you that peace is not something you chase. It is something you allow. Let your thoughts rise and fall like the tide. Let them come. Let them go. Feel the pillow beneath your head, the weight of your body easing into stillness, the quiet warmth of the dark surrounding you. Nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be finished. Breathe in. Breathe out. You can love without clutching. You can rest without solving. And when morning comes, you will find that the pebble has disappeared, not because you lost it, but because peace has learned your name. Story 4. The Sparrow Who Waited for Dawn. At the far edge of a quiet village stood a wooden house with a slanted roof and a small window facing east. Each morning, light crept through that window before the world had fully woken. Touching the sill, the old kettle and the corner of a table worn smooth by years of hands and silence. A sparrow had built its nest in the hollow beam just above the window. It was a small bird, gray-brown, like the dust of the road, with a single white feather on its wing that caught light like a thread of morning itself. The sparrow had learned the rhythm of the house. At dawn, the old woman who lived inside would slide open the window, letting in the breath of the world, the smell of damp earth, the sound of distant water, the faint rustle of bamboo leaves. She would pour tea into a chipped porcelain cup and hum softly an old tune that carried no words. The sparrow listened, tilting its head, feeling as if the melody was meant only for it. Then, one winter, the old woman stopped opening the window. Her chair remained empty by the table, her teacup untouched. The sparrow waited, hopping closer to the window, each morning peering in with small, dark eyes. Snow fell for 3 days, and the sparrow still waited. When at last the snow stopped, the world seemed quieter than before, too quiet, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to breathe. On the 4th day, the door opened. A young man stepped out, wearing a black coat, his face pale from lack of sleep. He looked up at the eaves where the sparrow perched, then down at the footprints he left in the snow. He did not see the bird clearly. His eyes were full of thoughts. He locked the door and walked away down the road, the sound of his steps fading into the stillness. The sparrow stayed. It did not understand where the old woman had gone. It waited on the roof as the sun set, the snow melting slowly around its claws. When night came, it tucked its head beneath its wing and tried to rest. But the air felt heavy, and the silence kept shifting a kind of emptiness that seemed to move like wind without direction. For days it waited, growing thinner, watching the window that never opened. Sometimes The wind blew against the frame and made a soft, creaking sound, and the sparrow would flutter its wings, thinking someone was coming. But no one did. Then one evening, as dusk blurred the line between sky and earth, the sparrow heard a sound from far away. A single chime, faint like a bell hidden in fog. It lifted its head, and for the first time in many days, it sang. The song was quiet, broken in places, but true. The sound traveled through the empty air, touched the snow, and disappeared into the horizon. That night was colder than any before. The wind came down from the mountains, carrying frost that burned like silver. The sparrow shivered in its nest, its small heart fluttering fast. It thought of the old woman's voice, of the steam that once rose from her tea, of the way dawn used to smell. It thought perhaps that she would want it to wait, not forever, but long enough for the light to find its way back. When the first hint of morning appeared, not light yet, just a soft lifting of darkness, the sparrow opened its eyes. The horizon was pale, trembling with a promise. It waited. Feathers puffed breath thin. It waited, even when frost touched its beak, even when its wings grew numb. It waited because something in the air felt alive again, as if the world itself was remembering how to move. And then it came, the first ray of dawn cutting through the fog, brushing the roof, finding the tiny curve of the sparrow's wing. The light was gentle, but it carried warmth, the kind that does not burn, but reminds. The sparrow chirped once, a sound small enough to be mistaken for a sigh, and felt its heart ease. The young man returned that same morning, his face drawn and weary. He opened the door, slowly, stepped inside, and set down a bundle of herbs. The house smelled of dust and memory. When he saw the sparrow by the window, he smiled a small, tired smile that cracked something open inside him. He poured water into the kettle, lit a small flame, and waited for the sound of the boil. Outside, the sparrow watched, recognizing the movement, the rhythm, the ritual. He lifted the window slightly. Cold air rushed in. The sparrow hopped onto the sill, tilting its head. "She used to feed you, didn't she?" he whispered. The bird chirped softly, as if answering. He took a crumb of bread from his pocket and placed it near the window. The sparrow pecked, once cautious, then twice, and stayed. Every morning after that, he repeated the gesture. Open the window, boil the tea, leave a crumb. He never tried to touch the sparrow, never chased it away. They lived like two souls, keeping company without speaking. Some mornings, when the light fell just right, he could almost feel his mother's presence in the room. The soft hum returning the warmth of unseen hands, adjusting the cup. The sparrow became her echo, a messenger between silence and memory. As spring came, the world softened. Snow melted into thin streams that trickled down the road. Blossoms opened shyly, at first, then all at once painting the air with scent. The sparrow built a new nest, stronger, with twigs and strands of the old woman's hair it found caught in the window latch. Life had begun again, not as before, but in a way that carried the memory of gentleness. One afternoon, the young man sat by the window, sketching the mountains. He looked up at the sparrow and said, "You waited, didn't you? You didn't leave." The bird chirped in response, fluffing its feathers. He smiled. "Then, you must know something about dawn I don't." And perhaps it did. Perhaps the sparrow understood that dawn does not come because we wish for it, nor because we deserve it, but because the world has a kindness too deep to measure a promise that light will always return, even if we forget how to look for it. Years later, the house would pass to someone else. The young man grew old, and his hair turned white, like the snow that once covered the roof. Yet every spring, sparrows returned to nest under the eaves. Travelers who passed by the house noticed the same small ritual. The window slightly open, a crumb of bread on the sill, and a kettle steaming faintly inside. They would pause for a moment, feeling a calm they couldn't explain. They did not know about the old woman, or the boy, or the long winter when a single sparrow waited for dawn. They only knew that something about that house felt alive, as if it had learned the patience of light. And now, as you listen as night folds itself gently around you, imagine that small sparrow resting on the edge of a window somewhere, waiting not with fear, but with trust. The world outside your own window may still be dark, but darkness is not absence. It is the quiet place where light begins to breathe. Breathe with it. Wait with it. Let the world take its time to turn. You do not need to rush the morning. You only need to stay soft enough to feel it when it comes. Story 5. The Pot That Sang at Night. In a village shaped by wind and earth, where every roof carried the color of clay, and the smell of rain lingered long after storms had gone, there lived a potter named Haru. His workshop sat at the edge of the fields where wheat swayed like gold in summer, and the air at dusk shimmered with dust and song. He was known not for perfection, but for patience. His hands were slow, his shapes uneven. Yet people said his pots carried something invisible, a warmth that could not be fired in any kiln. Each morning before sunrise, Haru gathered clay by the river. He kneaded it with his palms, pressing rhythm into the soil. He spoke to it as he worked small murmurs, like one might whisper to a sleeping child. "Be patient," he would say. "You will remember what you were meant to be." Then he shaped the clay on his wheel, watching it rise and turn under his fingers, soft at first, then strong. To him, every piece had a voice. Some whispered, some waited. Some trembled with stories not yet told. In the evenings, when the last light bled out of the sky, he stacked his finished pots beside the fire and sat with his tea. The house would creak, the wind would pass, and sometimes, in the quiet, he thought he heard music, a faint hum, a sound like a breath caught between two heartbeats. It came from the pots. The first time he heard it, he laughed, thinking it was wind through the cracks of the window. But the sound came again, soft but certain, rising from the rows of vessels in the dark. He leaned close, listening. The sound was not a melody, but a vibration, as though the air itself was remembering the shape of hands. It happened only at night, when the kiln was cool and the world was silent. He never told anyone. Instead, he began leaving one pot unfired each week, raw clay left unfinished on purpose. To listen longer, he said. The villagers began to notice his habit. "Why leave them unbaked?" they asked. "They'll melt in the rain." Haru only smiled. "Not everything is meant to last," he said. "Some things are meant to sing." One autumn, a merchant from the city came through the village. He admired Haru's work and bought several pieces for a high price. Before leaving, he pointed to one of the unfired pots resting near the door. "Why not finish this one?" he asked. "It's beautiful, but useless like this." Haru shook his head. "It already finished what it came here to do." "And what's that?" "It taught me to stop trying to finish everything." The merchant frowned, not understanding, and left. Haru placed the unfired pot near his bed that night. As he drifted to sleep, the same faint hum began again, rising like a heartbeat beneath the clay. He dreamed of rivers that sang and mountains that breathed of all the things in the world that made sound without trying to. Winter came early that year. Snow lay heavy on the rooftops, and the air inside the workshop turned brittle. Haru worked slower, now his joints aching, his fire reluctant to burn bright. Still, he shaped the clay each day, though his pieces grew smaller, simpler. The villagers brought him food, checked on him, asked if he needed help. He only thanked them and returned to his wheel. One of them, a young girl named Sora, often stayed behind to watch. She loved the sound of the wheel spinning the rhythm of his hands, the silence between movements. One evening, when the snow outside was blue and the lamps glowed amber, Sora asked Master Haru, "Why do your pots sing at night?" Haru smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening like the lines of an old river. "Because they remember where they came from," he said. "Every pot has air inside it breath. When night comes, the breath moves. That's what you hear. But I have other pots at home," she said. "They don't sing." He chuckled. Perhaps they haven't learned how to listen yet. That night, when the fire burned low, Haru listened once more. The pots hummed softly, their tones weaving like threads of unseen music. It wasn't beautiful in the way a song is beautiful. It was imperfect, trembling, uneven, but it was alive. He closed his eyes, resting his head against the cool wall. He thought about all the things in life that are meant to hold pots, hearts, memories, and how each must first learn to be empty. In the early hours before dawn, he awoke to silence. The fire had gone out, and frost covered the inside of the window. He stood, wrapped his shawl tighter, and went to check the kiln. The pots stood still, glistening faintly in the pale light. He reached out and touched one. It was cold, but something within it pulsed, not sound this time, but a feeling like a quiet yes. He smiled. "Good morning," he whispered. The next day, Sora came by and found him sitting beside the wheel, his hands folded in his lap. The unfired pot from the night before sat before him, its surface shimmering faintly with frost. "It sang again," she said, as though the air itself had told her. Haru nodded. "Yes," he said. "They always sing when they know someone is listening." That winter was his last. When spring came, the villagers found the workshop empty except for his tools, his wheel, and rows of pots lined neatly along the wall. On the work table sat a note written in his uneven hand. "Every vessel carries its own silence. Some break, some fade, some remain. But each remembers the touch that made it. Listen, and you'll hear what you once held." Sora kept the note. She took one of the unfired pots, the last one, and placed it by her bed. That night, when the wind moved through the cracks of her small window, she thought she heard a sound. It was faint, like the whisper of a remembered song, but it filled her room with warmth. She closed her eyes and smiled, realizing that what Haru had made was never just pottery. It was a way of hearing the world breathe. Years later, she too became a potter. Her pieces were finer than his, shaped with skill and grace. But she never forgot his rule: one pot left unfinished to keep the night company. Visitors would sometimes ask why one vessel always sat raw among the finished ones. She would touch it gently and say, "This one is still speaking." And when she grew old and her hands slowed, she would sit by the fire and listen. Sometimes she heard nothing. Sometimes she heard everything: the river, the wind, the laughter of a teacher she had once known. Each sound, no matter how small, reminded her that silence was never empty. It was simply waiting to be met. So, tonight, as the world around you falls quiet, imagine those clay pots in the dark, still humble alive. Listen to the air move through the hollow spaces of your own chest. Feel the gentle hum that never stops, even when words fade. That too is the sound of being. You don't need to make it louder. You don't need to make it perfect. Just listen, and you will hear that the whole world and you have been singing all along. Story 6. The Footprints Beyond the Gate. At the edge of the temple grounds, where the moss grew thick between the stones, and the wind carried the smell of cedar, there stood an old wooden gate. It had been there for generations, its beams worn smooth by time and touch. The monks called it the silent threshold, because beyond it, a narrow path wound upward into the mountains and disappeared into mist. No one knew exactly where it led. Some said it ended at a hidden lake that reflected the sky. Others whispered that it went on forever, circling the world before returning to the same place. Among those who lived in the temple was a young monk named Ren. He was quiet, devoted, and full of questions he did not yet know how to ask. When he first arrived, the abbot told him, "Everything you seek is already here, within the walls." Ren bowed, but his eyes kept drifting toward the gate. Every evening, after chores were done, he would stand near it, watching the light fade through the cracks, tracing with his gaze the faint footprints pressed into the earth beyond. One night, unable to resist the pull any longer, he asked the abbot, "Master, may I walk beyond the gate?" The abbot was tending a small fire, warming his hands. "The path is not forbidden," he said, "but remember, every step you take outward must also lead inward." Ren bowed again, though he did not yet understand. Before dawn the next morning, he rose, packed a small bundle of rice and tea, and crossed the threshold. The gate creaked behind him, not as warning, but as farewell. The air outside smelled different, wilder, sharper. The path wound through the forest where dew clung to the ferns, and the song of unseen birds echoed between trees. For a while, Ren walked in silence, each step slow and careful, as though he might disturb something ancient. The higher he climbed, the softer the sounds of the temple became, until only his own breathing filled his ears. By midday, he reached a clearing. The sun hung low behind drifting clouds, and a narrow stream split the earth before him. He knelt to drink. As the water touched his lips, he noticed footprints on the opposite bank, human, but faint, as if made long ago and half erased by rain. They led further into the woods. Without thinking, he followed them. The forest grew dense. Shadows deepened. He walked until his feet ached, and the light thinned into gray. He began to wonder if he had wandered too far when he heard something, not sound exactly, but the quiet sense of being watched. He turned and saw a little way off an old man sitting on a rock, mending a fishing net, though there was no water nearby. "Good evening," Ren said, bowing slightly. "I didn't expect to find anyone here." The old man smiled without looking up. "Few expect to find what is already waiting." Ren hesitated. "Have you lived here long? Long enough to stop counting?" The old man said. "And you?" "I came from the temple below. I wanted to see where the path leads." "Does it matter where it leads?" Ren frowned. "How can I know? Unless I walk it." The old man nodded, still smiling. "Then walk. Just don't forget the footprints you follow are your own." Ren blinked, unsure what to say. When he looked again, the old man had vanished, and the net lay folded neatly on the stone. The forest around him seemed to breathe. He continued walking. Night fell. Stars appeared, trembling faintly through the branches. He found shelter beneath a cedar and lit a small fire. The warmth flickered across his face, and the world grew smaller, just flame, breath, heartbeat, and silence. He thought of the temple of the abbot's calm gaze, of how every morning they swept the same courtyard, raked the same patterns into the gravel. At the time, it had felt repetitive, meaningless. Now, under the open sky, he understood that repetition was another kind of path, one that circles, not because it is lost, but because it stays. When dawn arrived, he woke to frost. His footprints glowed faintly in the dew leading back toward the gate. He smiled, but turned the other way. The mountains called, and his feet obeyed. Days became weeks. He crossed ridges, valleys, and streams. Sometimes he met travelers, sometimes only wind. At times, he felt utterly alone, yet never abandoned. Each night, as he prepared his small fire, he looked at his bare feet and thought, "This too is practice." He began to see the world as the abbot had described, not separate from the temple, but another room of the same house. One evening, he reached a wide plain covered in reeds. In the distance stood a single tree, its branches stretching like arms in prayer. Ren walked to it and found a stone beneath its roots carved with words faded by age. He brushed away the moss and read, "The gate you seek is behind you." He laughed quietly, the sound breaking like water. The wind stirred the reeds, and he felt something loosen in his chest. He looked down and saw his own footprints stretching in both directions, toward where he had come from and toward where he would go. In that moment, he realized they were one and the same. He turned back toward the mountains. The path home was long, but his steps felt light. When he reached the temple gate, many weeks later, the abbot was waiting. "You've returned," the old man said. Ren bowed deeply. "I followed the path, Master." "And what did you find?" Ren smiled. "That it was never outside." The abbot nodded. "Then leave your shoes here," he said gently. "You won't need them anymore." That night, Ren walked barefoot through the courtyard. The stones were cool, the air sweet with the scent of rain. He looked down and saw faint marks where many feet had walked before lines of dust and time crossing, vanishing, beginning again. He understood now that the world itself was a gate opening and closing with every breath. When he lay down to sleep, he dreamt of walking once more beyond the gate, but this time each footprint he left filled instantly with light. The path did not end. It curved back toward him, endless, silent kind. And as you listen, perhaps you can feel it too, the quiet trace of your own steps fading into stillness, the way the earth holds your weight and then releases it. The path you seek has never been elsewhere. It begins wherever you stand. Breathe in, step once. You are already beyond the gate. Story 7. The Thread of Morning Light. In a small town near the sea, where mornings began, not with alarm clocks, but with the sound of waves brushing against wooden piers, there lived an old woman named May. She was a weaver, the last one in a line of artisans whose hands had spent lifetimes learning how to listen to thread. Her workshop was a narrow room that faced the east, and each dawn, the first beam of sunlight would slip through the paper window and rest upon her loom. She called that light her first companion of the day. May had been weaving for so long that her body had memorized the rhythm even when her mind drifted elsewhere. Her fingers moved not by thought, but by memory, the shuttle gliding back and forth, the warp and weft meeting in quiet conversation. The room smelled faintly of dye and salt air, and when the wind came through, the hanging cloths fluttered like slow waves. She never hurried. The town had grown busy around her factories, machines, noise, but inside her little workshop, time still followed the pace of breath. People came from far away to buy her cloth. They said it had warmth that no machine could replicate. Some swore they could feel sunlight woven into it, or the hush of dawn hidden between the fibers. When asked her secret, May would smile and say, "I only weave what morning gives me." But morning, like everything else, began to change. The sea grew louder, the air harsher. Her eyesight dimmed. One winter, her right hand began to tremble, and the shuttle often slipped. She could no longer weave the fine patterns she used to. The young apprentices she once trained had moved to cities, chasing wages and bright lights. Her loom stood half-finished most days, threads hanging loose like the veins of an unfinished thought. One evening, after the last customer had left, May sat alone, staring at the loom. The twilight made everything look blue. The room, her hands, the air. She wondered if she had reached the end of her weaving, if the thread that connected her to her craft had finally frayed beyond repair. As she sat there, a memory returned of her mother, also a weaver sitting by the same loom many years ago. She remembered being a child watching her mother weave while the morning light fell across her hair. "The light will always come," her mother had said, "but it's our hands that must be ready to receive it." That night, May dreamed of a vast cloth stretching across the sky, woven not with thread, but with beams of dawn. Each strand shimmered like breath, and somewhere within it, she saw faces, those who had taught her, those who had left, those who had passed. They were all part of the same tapestry, endless and soft. When she woke, the dream stayed with her like a lingering fragrance. Before the sun rose, she went to the window. The sea was gray, the air sharp, but on the horizon, a faint thread of gold was beginning to appear. She felt something stir within her, not urgency, but a quiet invitation. She lit a small lamp, sat at her loom, and began to weave again. At first, her hands were stiff. The shuttle moved awkwardly, the threads tangled. But she did not stop. She breathed slowly, matching the rhythm of her heart to the sway of the loom. Outside, the light grew stronger, slipping through the window to touch the unfinished cloth. And when it did, something unexpected happened. The thread caught the light and held it glowing faintly, as if alive. May smiled. "There you are," she whispered. I thought I had lost you." From that morning on, she wove not to finish, but to listen. Each day she worked until the light shifted too high to reach her loom. Then she rested. The cloth grew slowly, each line imperfect, yet full of presence. She no longer cared about patterns or symmetry. Instead, she let the sunlight guide her, bright on some days, soft on others, muted when clouds passed. She began to realize that what she was weaving was not a blanket or garment, but time itself, each line a day lived, each knot a heartbeat remembered. Weeks passed. The townspeople noticed that her window glowed brighter than before. Those who came to visit said they felt calm the moment they stepped inside. The room seemed to hum with something invisible. Not sound, not scent, but the feeling of being met by silence that understands. They watched as she worked her trembling hand steady whenever the sunlight touched it. When they asked what she was making, she would say, "A piece for no one and for everyone." One morning, a young sailor came to her door. His ship was leaving at dawn, and he wanted a piece of her cloth to carry with him for luck. She looked at him, saw in his eyes the same restlessness she once had as a girl. "I cannot sell you this," she said, touching the cloth on her loom. "It is still listening." Instead, she reached for a scrap of fabric that had fallen to the floor, a threadbare piece, small and plain. She folded it and placed it in his hand. "Take this," she said. "It remembers morning." The sailor thanked her and left. Years later, he would return older, sunburned, carrying the same piece of cloth in a locket around his neck. He told her that on nights when the sea grew wild, he would take it out and hold it, and the storm would seem to soften. She only smiled. Then it learned how to travel, she said. As time went on, May grew frailer. Her hair turned white, her back curved, but still she sat by the loom. The cloth had grown long now, spilling onto the floor, shimmering faintly, even when the sun was gone. One evening, she felt her hands falter. The shuttle dropped. She picked it up, turned it over in her palms, and realized that the thread was nearly finished. There was only enough for one last line. She hesitated, then tied the end carefully and whispered, "Thank you for staying." The next morning, the neighbors found her sitting peacefully by the loom. Her eyes closed, her hands resting on the final weave. Sunlight streamed through the window, touching her face and the cloth beside her. It seemed to glow golden, gentle alive. They covered her with it before they carried her to the sea. Years later, people still spoke of May's cloth. Some said it was lost to the waves. Others believed it was kept in the temple, hanging above the altar, where morning light could reach it. But sometimes, when the sun rose just right and the mist over the town turned to gold, the fishermen swore they could see a faint shimmer across the water, like a thread of morning light stretched from the horizon to the shore. And now, as you listen, perhaps you can feel that thread, too soft, warm, weightless, connecting you to every morning you have ever lived. It runs through your breath, your heartbeat, your memories. It reminds you that even when days feel dim, the light has never stopped arriving. So let it touch you now. Let it weave itself through your quiet. You are part of the same tapestry, unfinished, glowing, infinite. Story 8. The Lake That Listened. There was a valley, cupped gently between two mountain ridges, hidden from the main road by a long sweep of cedar and pine. Travelers who passed nearby sometimes spoke of a small lake there so still that when the wind died, the clouds above appeared sharper in its reflection than in the sky itself. No one knew its depth. The locals called it the Listening Lake, though no one remembered who had named it first. They said it could hold every sound it was given, even the ones too soft to be heard. Beside that lake stood a cabin made of old birchwood. A man named Elias had lived there for nearly half his life. He was neither hermit nor monk. He simply preferred quiet over conversation. Each morning, he swept the small deck, boiled water for tea, and sat facing the water until the steam faded. He never rushed the day. The world, he once told a wandering postman, already had enough people chasing it. Elias had come to the valley many years ago, after the city where he lived burned through his patience. He had been a musician, then cellist in a small orchestra, traveling from one concert hall to another. The applause had thrilled him at first, but over time, the clapping began to sound like rain on tin roofs, loud, endless, and without warmth. When his wife passed the music inside, him stopped. He sold the cello, packed a small trunk, and followed the sound of silence until it led him to the lake. At first, the stillness frightened him. The nights were too vast, the quiet too deep. He would lie awake, listening to his own heartbeat, wondering if he'd made a mistake. But as months turned into seasons, he began to hear subtler things, the sigh of wind against the reeds, the slow breathing of water beneath the moon, even the faint creak of the trees shifting in their roots. He realized that the world was never truly silent. It only whispered to those who had slowed enough to listen. One spring morning, while collecting driftwood near the shore, Elias noticed a young woman standing at the edge of the forest. She wore a faded coat and carried a sketchbook under her arm. She looked uncertain, as though she had stumbled there by accident. When she saw him, she hesitated, then asked, "Is this your lake?" He smiled. "It belongs to whoever listens." She nodded slowly and walked closer. Her name was Lena. She was an artist who had traveled north after losing her sight in one eye. "I used to paint the sea," she told him, "but now the horizon feels uneven. I thought maybe a smaller water might be kinder." Elias offered her tea. They sat by the water in comfortable silence. When she opened her sketchbook, he expected to see drawings, but instead found the pages filled with lines of writing, short fragments like notes to herself. One read, "Stillness has color too." Another said, "I draw with my memory now." Days passed, and she kept returning. Sometimes she would sit by the lake from dawn to dusk, tracing the air with her hand, as though sketching the wind. Sometimes she would ask Elias questions about the sound of things. What does fog sound like when it moves? Does moonlight have a rhythm? He never had an answer, but the questions pleased him. They made the silence feel alive again. As summer deepened, the lake grew mirror-like, holding everything that passed above it. Birds, clouds, stars, even the fleeting shape of dreams. One evening, after a long rain, Lena said, "When I first came here, I wanted to see again. Now I think I just want to be seen." Elias looked at her reflection in the water, soft, blurred, luminous. "The lake sees you," he said. "It doesn't need eyes to do so." She smiled, and for a moment the air felt lighter. Then she asked, "Why did you come here?" He was quiet for a long time. "Because I stopped hearing what I was playing," he said at last. "The music became noise, and I didn't know how to listen anymore." Lena touched the surface of the lake with her fingertips. "Maybe it's still listening for you." That night, Elias dreamt of his cello. It stood alone on the deck strings, vibrating, though no one played. The notes rose like mist, slow and tender. He woke before dawn and stepped outside. The lake was perfectly still. He whispered a few notes under his breath, a melody half remembered, half invented. The water trembled as if answering. From that day on, he began to hum again while he worked. Sometimes, without thinking, he tapped rhythm against the wooden rail. Lena noticed and said, "You sound like you're weaving something invisible." He laughed. "Maybe I'm tuning the silence." When autumn came, the first frost painted silver at the edges of the leaves. Lena told him she would soon leave to return south before the snow closed the mountain roads. "Will you stay through the winter?" she asked. "I always do," he said. She hesitated, then unrolled one of her sketches. It was not an image, but a page covered in raised threads, tiny stitches forming ripples that mimicked water. She placed it in his hands. "For when the lake freezes," she said, "so you can still hear it with your fingers." He kept that cloth on his table through the long, quiet winter. Snow buried the cabin, and the world narrowed to firelight, wood smoke, and memory. Some nights he would hold the stitched page and run his fingers across it, feeling each line like the echo of her voice. The lake outside lay frozen, but he could still sense its heartbeat deep below the ice. When spring returned, so did the water's song. Elias walked to the edge one morning and found that the ice had cracked in long silver veins, melting into 1,000 mirrors. He knelt, touching the surface. "Welcome back," he whispered. The reflection that looked up at him was older, softer, but peaceful. Years passed this way. Sometimes visitors found their way to the lake. Travelers, hikers, wanderers, and Elias would greet them with tea. Each one left saying the same thing, that the place had a strange calm, as though the water remembered their voices long after they'd gone. And when Elias was gone too, when the cabin fell quiet and the wind swept clean the footprints from the shore, people still said the lake listened. On still mornings, they claimed you could hear a faint sound rising from the water, like a bow drawing gently across a single cello string. No one could say if it was the echo of music or simply the wind's invention. But those who stayed long enough always felt the same, that the lake was not reflecting the sky above, but the silence inside them. Tonight, as you listen, imagine that lake waiting in the dark, patient, wide unjudging. Whatever you bring, your noise, your worry, your weariness, it will hold it without ripple. The world is full of echoes, but there is always one place that simply receives. Breathe. Let your thoughts fall like stones into the water. They will not sink or vanish. They will simply become part of the quiet. Story 9. The mountain's forgotten name. At the northern edge of the country, where the wind carried the scent of pine and old stone, there rose a mountain that had no name. Maps showed a blank space where its title should have been, and even the elders of nearby villages could not remember what people used to call it. Some said it had once been sacred, a place where monks walked barefoot across the clouds. Others believed the mountain had erased its own name after centuries of being misused and misunderstood. But most had simply stopped asking. At the foot of that nameless peak lived a man named June. He was a stonemason by trade, a quiet worker whose hands knew how to shape heaviness into harmony. Years ago, he had come to the valley with his wife, Hannah, to build a home beside the river. Together, they had raised walls of gray stone strong and simple, the kind that could withstand both wind and silence. But when Hannah fell ill and passed away one winter, June had stopped carving. The chisel dulled, the tools rusted, and the mountain across the river began to look larger every day. He started walking there at dawn, climbing as far as his legs would allow, before the fog swallowed the path. The mountain was steep, but gentle in its way. It didn't fight him. The higher he went, the quieter everything became. Birds grew silent. Streams slowed, even the wind seemed to bow. He found that the silence there did not frighten him. It wrapped around him like an unfinished prayer. One morning, he reached a ridge he hadn't seen before. There, half buried in moss, stood a weathered stone marker. The writing on it was almost gone, just faint lines, like veins under thin skin. June brushed it with his sleeve, trying to read, but the letters had worn away. He wondered if this was where the mountain's name had once been carved. A small hollow had formed in the center of the stone, filled with rainwater. When he looked into it, he saw the reflection of clouds drifting slowly by, erasing themselves. He sat beside the marker for a long time, listening to the faint pulse of wind moving through the grass. When he closed his eyes, he thought he could hear something underneath it. A rhythm, not quite music, not quite breath. It reminded him of Hannah humming while she worked the tune that had no words but always ended softly, like light fading through paper walls. He opened his eyes, but there was only the mountain. From that day on, June returned every morning. He brought his old chisel and a small hammer, tools he had not touched in years. He began carving again, not to restore the letters, but to learn what it meant to carve without needing to finish. He let the rhythm of his strikes follow his breathing, slow and patient. The mountain did not resist. The stone gave itself in small grains, falling quietly onto his knees. Seasons turned. Snow came and went. Rivers froze and thawed. The villagers sometimes saw him on the ridge and called out, asking what he was doing. He always answered the same, listening. They would laugh and shake their heads, but there was no mockery in it, only distance, as if his world had already shifted, somewhere theirs could not reach. One evening, after a long day of carving, June stayed on the mountain until twilight. The horizon glowed faintly pink, and mist gathered between the trees. He sat beside the stone marker and leaned his back against the earth. His hands were sore, but his chest felt light. A bird landed nearby, one of the small gray ones that nested in the cracks of the rock. It tilted its head at him, curious. "You remember, don't you?" he said softly. You know what this place was called? The bird chirped once and flew away into the fog. That night, he dreamed of Hannah. She was standing on the mountain, her hair braided with small flowers, smiling. You came far, she said, but not far from me. When he reached for her, she stepped backward into the mist, and her voice echoed faintly. Names fade, but love is heavier than stone. He woke before dawn, heart still full of her words. He went to the river and washed his hands, watching the current take the dust from his palms. Then he packed his tools and climbed again. At the ridge, he looked at the stone marker one last time. He took the chisel not to carve letters, but to smooth the surface until all traces of the old writing were gone. When he finished, the stone gleamed faintly in the morning light, bare and clean as an untouched page. That winter, the villagers noticed something strange. When the snow fell, it never seemed to stay long on the mountain slopes. It melted faster there, as if the earth itself was warm. And when travelers passed through the valley and asked for the name of the mountain, the locals simply pointed and said, "It listens." Years later, when June was gone, hikers sometimes found the smooth stone at the ridge. They said that if you placed your ear against it, you could hear faint echoes, not words, but the murmur of wind, the pulse of rain, the memory of hands at work. Some swore they heard two voices, one low and steady, one soft and bright, weaving together like water flowing over rock. And so the mountain remained nameless. Or perhaps it had finally remembered its truest name, the one spoken not with tongues, but with silence. Tonight, as you listen, imagine standing there yourself, the air thin and clean, the wind brushing your face, the ground humming beneath your feet. The world around you holds countless names, but the one that matters has no sound. It lives in the space between heartbeats, in the breath before the word, in the stillness that answers when all questions have fallen away. You do not need to know the name of peace to feel it. You only need to stand still long enough for it to recognize you. Breathe in, breathe out, and let the silence say your name back. Story 10. The Candle That Dreamed of the Moon. In a quiet town by the sea, there was an old shop that sold candles. It stood on the corner of a narrow street, the kind where the air always smelled faintly of salt and wax. The owner was a woman named Aya, who had learned the craft from her grandfather. Her hands were small but sure, and she poured each candle as if she were shaping a piece of light itself. The shelves of her shop glowed even when unlit rows of ivory amber and rose-colored candles that waited like silent singers before a song. Each evening, when the last customer had gone and the sky turned the color of ink, Aya would light a single candle and place it by the window. She said it kept the darkness company. From across the street, people often saw that little flame flickering against the glass and thought of it as a kind of promise that no matter how late it was, someone was still awake, tending a small, gentle fire. One winter night, when the moon was full and the tide was low, Aya found a small candle left behind on the counter. It was a plain one, short, pale, almost ordinary. She couldn't remember who had made it or when. Still, she placed it on the windowsill and struck a match. The flame rose, trembling, then steadied. Outside, the sea shimmered like a sheet of silver. The candle's light met the moonlight on the glass, and for a moment, Aya couldn't tell which one was reflection and which was real. From that night on, she began to light the same candle every evening. It seemed to burn differently from the others, slower, softer, as if it were breathing. Some nights, when Aya stayed late working, she imagined the candle leaning toward the window, as though longing for something beyond it. "You're staring at the moon again," she would whisper with a smile. "Careful, or you'll burn yourself trying to reach it." Time passed, and the candle grew shorter. Its wax pooled around its base like melted pearls. Yet each night, Aya lit it again, and each night the flame reached just as high. Then, one evening, a storm rolled in from the sea. The wind howled through the cracks of the old building, rattling the door. Rain struck the window like 1,000 small hands. Aya moved to close the shutters, but before she could, a sudden gust blew through and snuffed out the flame. She sighed, relit it, and whispered, "Stay with me tonight." The candle flickered weakly, its light dancing between her fingers. Outside, thunder rolled like a drum, and waves crashed against the shore. Aya stayed by the window until the storm passed, watching the reflection of the flame waver beside the moon, now hidden behind clouds. When morning came, the candle had burned down to almost nothing. Only a small stump remained, the wick curled like a question mark. Aya touched the cooled wax and felt a strange sadness, the kind that comes when something gentle ends without ceremony. She thought of remelting the wax into a new candle, but hesitated. Instead, she placed the stump in a small wooden box on her workbench. "You've earned your rest," she said. Days turned into weeks, and Aya forgot about the candle. Spring arrived, bringing softer light and the smell of the sea thawing. One evening, while cleaning her workshop, she found the box again. She opened it and inside lay the candle, pale and cracked, yet still carrying the faint scent of salt and smoke. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt compelled to light it one last time. She set it on the sill, struck a match, and waited. To her surprise, the wick caught easily. The flame rose bright and steady, taller than before, as though it had been waiting. The air in the room seemed to hush. Outside, the moon was climbing above the sea, round and luminous. The candle's flame leaned toward it, and Aya could have sworn it was stretching higher, reaching for the light beyond the glass. The wax began to drip, slow and deliberate, forming small rivers that hardened as they cooled. For hours, Aya sat beside it, listening to the whisper of the flame. She thought about her grandfather, who used to say that every flame is a prayer in motion. When you light a candle, he had told her, you don't destroy darkness, you teach it how to glow. The thought made her smile. "Is that what you're doing now?" she asked the candle softly. "Teaching the night." Outside, the moon rose higher, bathing the room in silver. The flame swayed once, as if bowing. Then, just as dawn began to color the horizon, the candle burned down completely. Aya expected silence, but for a moment, after the wick died, the air still shimmered faintly, as though the light had not vanished, but simply moved elsewhere. That morning, Aya carried the little pool of cooled wax to the shore. The tide was calm, the sand smooth as paper. She set the wax down near the water's edge, and as the sun rose, the waves crept forward and lifted it gently, carrying it out into the sea. She stood watching until it disappeared beneath the light. "Thank you," she whispered. Years later, people who passed the old shop said that on certain nights, when the moon was full, a pale glow could be seen floating above the water, like a small flame that refused to drown. Some thought it was reflection. Others said it was the spirit of the candle still dreaming of the moon. Aya grew older, her hair turning the color of ash, her hands slower. Yet she kept lighting candles each night, always leaving one by the window. When she was asked why, she would answer, "Because light deserves to travel." And so, even after she was gone, the townspeople continued the ritual. Every evening, one window along the coast would flicker to life, small, steady, constant. Fishermen at sea used it to find their way back home. Lovers walking the shore took it as a sign that some part of the world was still awake, still keeping watch. Tonight, as you listen, imagine that candle burning quietly somewhere beyond your sight. A small flame bending toward the moon, neither reaching nor retreating, simply shining because it can. The night around you is vast, but it is not empty. Somewhere in that darkness, every kindness you've ever given still glows. You don't have to reach the moon. You only have to remember that you too are made of light. Breathe slowly. Let your heart flicker, steady and soft, and rest knowing that even when the flame seems uyojai, its warmth lingers, quiet, unseen, eternal. And now, as the last candle has gone out, and the moon has slipped behind a veil of thin clouds, we too arrive at the end of this journey. These past 10 stories, each one was not just a tale, but a breath, a stream of water, a soft and steady heartbeat. Some spoke of letting go. Some were about waiting, and some were simply quiet moments between two breaths. If right now you feel a little lighter in your heart, if your breaths are deeper, if sleep feels closer, then these stories have done what they were meant to do. Because meditation is not about understanding. It is about returning. It is not about effort. It is about allowing. Allowing yourself to pause, to breathe, to be still, so that in that stillness you can see that life is still unfolding gently and beautifully. Let tonight come to a peaceful close. There is nothing you need to hold on to, nothing you need to keep thinking about. Just lie down. Let every sound dissolve like smoke. Let your heart stop bracing, and let sleep take care of the rest. If these stories have helped you feel at ease, comforted, or even just brought a quiet smile to your face, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so that each evening you can return to this place where these small meditation stories will continue to be told to lull you to sleep, to heal, and to remind you that peace has never left you. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Wishing you a peaceful night, a deep and restful sleep, and a gentle morning when the dawn arrives. We will see you again in the next meditation. Stories where breath, light, and stillness meet once more as if for the very first time.